Tonight, you will turn on a stove. You will put something in a pan and wait. Heat will do the rest. It is the most ordinary act a human being can perform, and you will not think about it for a single second. But food was not the first thing your ancestors cooked. Long before bread, long before anything you would recognize as a meal. Somewhere on the southern coast of Africa, a person knelt beside a fire, scraped a shallow pit into the sand, and buried a stone. Not to eat it, to change it. You have been told a simple story about fire. Fire kept your ancestors warm. Fire pushed the predators back into the dark. Fire cooked the meat and made it soft and made it safe and gave your ancestors the energy to grow the enormous, hungry brain you are using to understand this sentence right now. But the real answer is far stranger, because your ancestors did not only put food into the fire, they put the ground itself into the fire. They cooked rock, they cooked earth, they cooked sap and shell and bone. And the reason they did it may have built more of the mind inside your skull than any meal ever served. Start with the rock. It is called silcrete. It looks unremarkable, a dull greyish stone common across parts of southern Africa, hard enough to break bone, boring enough that you would step over 1,000 of them on a walk. If you picked one up today, you would put it back down. And for most of human history, that is exactly what your ancestors did, because raw silcrete is a difficult material. Understand what making a stone blade actually requires. You cannot simply smash one rock with another and hope for an edge. You have to strike the stone at a precise angle with a precise force so that a flake peels away in a smooth curving fracture, leaving behind an edge that can be sharper than surgical steel. That requires the stone to break predictably, to fracture the way glass fractures in clean conchoidal waves that travel exactly where you send them. Coarse, stubborn, raw silcrete does not do that. It crumbles. It splits along hidden flaws. It shatters in the wrong direction and takes your afternoon with it. Compared to the fine flints and cherts that toolmakers prized, it is a frustrating, wasteful rock. So why does the archaeological record of southern Africa suddenly fill with beautiful, delicate, precisely worked silcrete blades? The answer came out of a cave on a cliff above the Indian Ocean at a site called Pinnacle Point. The archaeologist Kyle Brown, working with Curtis Marine, kept noticing something strange about the silcrete tools coming out of those sediments. They had a gloss to them, a faint, waxy, reddish sheen on the flaked surfaces, like the stone had been polished from the inside out. He went looking for raw silcrete in the surrounding landscape to compare. The local rock looked nothing like it, so he tried to make it look like that. He collected raw stone. He built fires, and he tried the obvious thing first. He threw the rock straight into the flames. It exploded. Water trapped inside the stone flashed instantly into steam and blew it apart. That is what happens when you are impatient with the earth. So he slowed down. He dug a pit into the sand. He laid the stone inside it. He covered it over. Then he built his fire on top of the sand so that the heat had to soak downwards slowly through the insulating grains over many hours. The temperature climbed gradually toward roughly 300 degrees Celsius. It held there, and then it fell just as gradually through the night, as the coals died and the sand gave its warmth back to the sky. The next morning, he dug the stone out. It had changed. Not on the outside, on the inside. At the microscopic level, the silica within the rock had rearranged itself. Tiny crystals had fused and knitted together, closing the microscopic flaws that made the material so unpredictable. The stone was now finer, denser, glossier. It flaked exactly where he struck it, in clean and elegant curves. It gave him edges he simply could not have made the day before. He had not shaped the rock. He had upgraded it. Now hold that image in your mind, because you need to understand what that actually took. To heat treat a stone, you must first believe in something invisible. You must believe that a rock has an interior, that it has hidden properties, a secret architecture, that determine how it behaves in your hands. You must believe those properties can be altered by something you also cannot see, which is heat, moving slowly through sand over the course of a day and a night. And you must be willing to bury the stone, which means it disappears. You cannot watch. Nothing happens that you can observe. There is no bubbling, no browning, no sizzle, no smell. There is only sand, and time, and a fire that must be neither too hot nor too cold, and a person sitting beside it who has decided, on no visible evidence whatsoever, that this is worth doing. And then, tomorrow, You dig.
Can you feel how enormous that is?
Cooking a piece of meat gives you feedback. It changes color. It smells like something your body already wants. It hisses. Every one of your senses is telling you in real time that you are on the right track, and the reward arrives within the hour.
Cooking a rock gives you nothing. Nothing at all.
You are working entirely from a model held inside your own head, a belief about a hidden process, sustained across a cold night with no signal, no reward, and no reassurance until dawn.
That is not tool use. That is chemistry.
And there is a further layer, and it is the one that should genuinely stop you. This was not one clever person's lucky accident. The evidence at Pinnacle Point runs back at least 72,000 years, and Brown and Marine argued the practice may reach considerably deeper into the past than that. It shows up again and again, across layers, across generations, across thousands of years of human beings being born, learning, and dying.
Which means someone taught it.
Someone stood over a pit and explained a procedure that cannot be demonstrated in a single moment. Someone described the depth of the sand, the size of the fire, the length of the weight, to a person who had to accept most of it on trust, and who would only discover whether they had understood it correctly at sunrise.
Language,
Patience, instruction, faith in an unseen mechanism.
a recipe, all of it.
For a rock. But how would anyone today know the difference? A stone tool sitting in a museum drawer does not come with a label saying it spent a night buried under a fire.
This is where the work becomes genuinely clever.
Brown and his colleagues did not simply eyeball the gloss and declare victory. They built a controlled experiment. They took raw silcrete from the same landscape, heated batches of it to different temperatures, and compared what came out. They looked at the flake surfaces and they measured the way light scattered off them. They used a technique called thermoluminescence, which reads how much radiation energy a mineral has stored up over time, and can reveal whether that stored signal was ever wiped clean by heat. A rock that has been baked carries a fingerprint of that baking, and it carries it for tens of thousands of years.
The ancient tools carried the fingerprint, and not just a few of them. In some layers at Pinnacle Point, the majority of the silcrete had been treated. This was not one experiment by one curious individual. This was standard operating procedure.
Which raises the question that makes this whole story strange again.
Why bother?
Because heat treatment is not free. It costs fuel, which someone has to gather. It costs time, which is the one thing a foraging life never has enough of. It costs risk, because if you get the ramp wrong, the stone cracks and the whole investment is gone. If your goal is simply a sharp edge, there were easier rocks in the world.
And that may be exactly the point. Curtis Marine has argued for years that this stretch of the South African coast was a refuge.
During the brutal glacial swings of the Ice Age, when much of the continent turned hostile, this narrow coastal strip stayed livable, feeding people and shellfish and tubers when almost nowhere else could. But the rock available there was silcrete. Difficult, ugly, unreliable silcrete.
So your ancestors did not go looking for a better landscape. They upgraded the one they were standing in. That is a different kind of animal.
An animal that does not simply move to where the good resources are, but stays where it is and manufactures the resource it needs out of the mediocre material in front of it. Every civilization that followed is an elaboration of that one move.
And once you notice this, you cannot stop seeing it, because the rock was not an isolated experiment. It was one line in a much longer manual.
Take ochre. Ochre is the pigment your ancestors used on their bodies, their walls, their tools, and their dead. It is iron-rich earth, and it comes out of the ground in a range of shades. Much of it is a dull, unimpressive yellow. But if you heat yellow ochre, something extraordinary happens. Water is driven out of the mineral structure, the iron compounds transform, and that drab yellow deepens, darkens, and turns a deep, arterial, unmistakable red.
Your ancestors figured that out too. They were not simply collecting red earth wherever they happened to find it.
They were manufacturing it. They were taking one substance and using controlled fire to convert it into a different substance. And they were doing it for reasons that have nothing to do with calories, nothing to do with warmth, and nothing to do with staying alive.
They did it for colour.
At Blombos Cave, further along that same South African coast, Christopher Henshelwood and his colleagues uncovered something that reads less like a campsite and more like a workshop. 2 abalone shells, roughly 100,000 years old, each containing the residue of a red pigment mixture. Around them lay the equipment: grindstones, hammerstones,
bone for stirring, charcoal. The shells had been used as containers, and the mixture inside them had been deliberately compounded from ochre, crushed bone, charcoal, and a liquid binder. That is a paint set, 100,000 years old. Somebody sourced the ingredients, processed them, combined them in the right order, stored the result in a vessel, and understood that the whole was different from the sum of its parts. And nobody ate any of it. Then it gets more complex still. At Sabudu Cave, the archaeologist Lynn Wadley studied residues clinging to ancient stone points and found something that should not have been possible for a mind that supposedly had not yet arrived. Your ancestors were not merely tying blades onto shafts, they were making glue, compound glue. Plant gum blended with powdered ochre and other additives, heated with great care over a fire to drive off precisely the right amount of moisture. Not too much, not too little. Wadley tried to replicate it herself, and she found the process maddeningly difficult. Add too much water and the adhesive is weak, and your spear point falls out of its shaft at the worst possible moment. Too little water, or too much heat, and the glue turns brittle and shatters on impact. The temperature has to be managed continuously. The mixture has to be watched, adjusted, corrected. And the ochre is not there for decoration at all. It is a functional ingredient, chemically altering the properties of the adhesive itself. Wadley argued that this required genuine abstract thought. The maker has to hold several variables in mind simultaneously, understand that invisible chemical properties are in play, and mentally juggle a recipe while executing it. That is not instinct. That is not imitation. That is engineering. And it was not only happening in Africa. Far to the north, in a colder world, Neanderthals were doing something similar with birch bark. Heat birch bark in the right way and it weeps a black, sticky tar, one of the oldest synthetic materials ever produced by a hominin. Modern researchers, including Paul Kazowick and Hiske Langehans, have spent years trying to work out how it was done with no pottery, no thermometers, and no metal. Their experiments show it can be achieved with surprisingly simple means, but every method demands control. Control of oxygen, control of temperature, control of time. Different species, different continent. Same idea. Put the world in the fire and wait, and something new comes out. Now step back and look at the whole shape of it, because the timeline matters. The oldest solid traces of fire inside a human home go back an astonishing distance. At Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, the researcher Francesco Berna and his team found burned bone and plant ash deep inside the chamber, in layers around 1 million years old, in a spot no lightning strike and no drifting grass fire could plausibly have reached. Fire was in the house very, very early, and for an enormous stretch of that time, fire mostly did what fire does. It warmed, it guarded, it cooked. The primatologist Richard Wrangham built an entire theory of human origins around exactly that. He argued that cooking food was the great engine of our evolution, because heat pre-digests your meal, breaking down tough fibers and unfolding proteins before they ever reach your gut. Cooked food gives up its energy far more cheaply. That surplus, Wrangham argued, is what allowed your ancestors to afford a brain that burns 1/5 of their calories while sitting perfectly still. It let the gut shrink and the skull swell. He may well be right. Cooking food gave you the fuel, but cooking food is not a leap of imagination. It is delicious. It is obvious. A carcass falls into a fire, someone tastes it, and nobody ever has to be persuaded again. The reward teaches the lesson. Cooking rock is different. Cooking rock has no smell, no taste, no warmth, no immediate payoff, and no obvious reason on earth to attempt it. There is no accident that teaches it, because a rock thrown carelessly into a fire does not become a better rock. It explodes. Heat treatment is the moment fire stopped being a comfort and became an instrument. It is the moment your ancestors stopped asking what fire could do for them and started asking what fire could do to things. And that question never stopped being asked. There is one more thing your ancestors did with hot rocks, and it is the strangest of all, because it turns the whole idea inside out. You cannot put a fire under a bag made of animal skin. You cannot put a fire under a bark container or a hole in the ground lined with hide. They will burn. So instead, your ancestors heated stones in the flames until they glowed, lifted them out, and dropped them straight into water. The water boiled. Drop in more stones, and it keeps boiling. Do this for long enough, with enough stones, and you can render fat and grease out of smashed animal bone, which the archaeologist Alan Ochre has studied in detail. Bone grease is a dense, high-energy food that is otherwise locked away inside the skeleton, useless to you, invisible to you. It is calories hidden inside a hard shell of mineral, and the only key that opens it is patient, prolonged rolling heat. So the rock became the pot before there were any pots. Sit with the loop in that. Fire heats the stone heats the water opens the bone feeds the brain, and the brain is the thing that worked out the sequence in the first place. Your ancestors were not just using fire, they were building machines out of it, because look at everything that follows from it. Every single thing. Heat rock, and you get better blades. Heat earth, and you get pigment, and pigment gives you symbols, and symbols give you art and identity and religion. Heat sap, and you get glue, and glue gives you the composite tool, the spear that is more than a stick and a stone. Heat clay, and you get pottery, and pottery lets you store grain and carry water and cook things you could never cook before. And stored grain lets you stay in one place, and staying in one place gives you villages, and then towns, and then cities. Heat limestone, and you get quicklime, and lime gives you plaster and mortar and walls that stand for 1,000 years. Heat sand hot enough, and you get glass, and glass eventually gives you the lens, and the lens gives you the microscope and the telescope, which is to say, it gives you the germ and the galaxy. And heat certain heavy coloured ores in a fire hot enough, and something impossible happens. The rock bleeds. Metal weeps out of the stone. That is copper, and then bronze, and then iron, and then in a straight and unbroken line, everything. Every one of those is the same single idea, repeated with more ambition. Bury something in fire. Wait. Trust that the invisible interior of the world will rearrange itself in your favor. The entire material history of your species is a footnote to one person kneeling in the sand, wondering what would happen if they waited until morning. But here's the part that should follow you home. The most important thing that got cooked was never the rock. Think about what that process actually trains a mind to do. It asks you to perform work today for a result you will not see until tomorrow. It asks you to follow steps whose purpose you cannot directly verify. It asks you to hold a hidden model of reality inside your head, act on it with total commitment, and then wait, in silence, with nothing whatsoever telling you whether you are a genius or a fool. That is not merely a technique. That is a way of being a mind, and you are still doing it, constantly, every single day of your life. You set an alarm at night for a person who does not exist yet. You put money into an account and watch nothing happen for 20 years. You swallow a tablet that produces no sensation at all on the authority of a mechanism you have never seen and could not explain, because someone you trust told you the recipe. You push a seed into bare soil and walk away. You preheat an oven and wait for a number. You send a message and wait for a reply that may never come. You spend a decade studying for a career that does not exist yet, in a city you have not moved to, for a version of yourself you have only imagined. Every one of those is a rock in a pit. You cannot see inside any of them. You are acting on a belief about the hidden interior of the world, holding your nerve across time, trusting that when you finally dig it up, it will have changed. And notice that almost none of it is yours. You did not derive the medicine. You did not test the seed. You did not discover the interest rate or the oven or the alarm. You are running recipes handed to you by people you will never meet, most of them long dead, and you follow the steps because the chain of instruction has held. That chain is the fragile thing. A recipe for heat treatment lives in exactly one place, and it is not the rock and it is not the fire. It lives in a person's memory, and it survives only if that person bothers to explain it, in words, to a child who is bored or distracted or in a hurry. Break the chain for one generation and the knowledge is simply gone, and the rock goes back to being a rock, and someone in 10,000 years has to invent it all over again from nothing. It did not break. Across 70,000 years, in the dark, beside fires, in languages that have vanished without leaving a single sound behind, somebody kept explaining it. That capacity is the oldest technology you own. It is older than farming, older than writing, older than every god whose name you have ever heard. It was forged, quite literally, in a sandpit beneath a fire on a cold African coast, by someone with no word for chemistry, No concept of a molecule. No idea that they were doing anything remarkable at all. Just a person with a strange conviction that the world had an inside, and that fire could reach it.
They could not have known what they were starting.
They could not have known that the same stubborn patience they were teaching their children, the willingness to bury something and believe in the morning, would end with a kitchen, with a switch, with a small blue flame that arrives instantly, on demand, every time, forever. So tonight, when you turn on that stove, when you put something in a pan and wait, and think about absolutely nothing at all, understand that the waiting is the invention. The pan is a detail. The flame is a detail. What you inherited was never the fire. What you inherited was the patience to bury something, walk away, and believe in the morning.